Rome wasn't built by citizens who were free to work, it was built by captives who had no choice. Conquest didn't just expand Rome's borders, it created a human commodity that could be bought and sold. Slaves captured in war were not a side effect of empire. They were the economic fuel, and yet the same system that powered Rome's rise also planted the seeds of its long, slow unraveling. How did an empire built on forced labor achieve centuries of growth, and why did that growth leave it fragile? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how systems of extreme control create wealth while quietly hollowing out the society beneath them. After the Punic Wars, especially following the destruction of Carthage, Rome experienced a population shock. Hundreds of thousands of captives flooded into Italy, and the Roman elite saw them not as people, but as an economic opportunity. Wealthy landowners began replacing the small farms of citizen soldiers with massive estates called These estates were operated entirely by enslaved workers who cost nothing beyond their initial purchase price. A captured man required no wages, no negotiation, no loyalty, only supervision and subsistence. This was the birth of a new economic logic. Human beings as zero-wage capital. The supply seemed endless because conquest itself produced the workforce. Each new war brought fresh captives, lowering the price of labor and increasing the incentive to expand the system. Small farmers, who had once been the backbone of Rome's army, could not compete with estates that paid nothing for labor. They watched their harvests undersold, their land consumed, their families pushed toward debt. Many sold their plots to the wealthy and migrated to Rome hoping for work. But in the city, there was no work, only to delay the grain distribution that kept the masses from starving. They became clients of powerful patrons, trading their votes for food and protection. The small farmer who had once owned his land now owned nothing but his dependents. Meanwhile, the elite accumulated vast fortunes and even greater political influence. The latifundia produced wine, oil, and grain at prices that ruined any free competitor. And because the slaves themselves had no money to spend, wealth concentrated upward with nothing leaking back down. Rome's economy began to resemble a funnel. Conquest at the wide end, treasure and slaves pouring in, and all of it collecting in the hands of a few. The system spread across the Mediterranean as provincial economies were reorganized to serve Roman appetites. Sicily became a factory for grain worked by enslaved thousands. Gaul and North Africa supplied wine and oil extracted by captive labor. Mines in Spain depended on slaves who rarely survived more than a few years underground. Rome itself became a consumer city, importing everything while producing nothing of material value. Its citizens lived on grain shipped from provinces worked by people who had no say in their own existence. This was growth, but it was growth built on extraction, not innovation. The engine of the economy was not efficiency or creativity, it was control, and control requires constant expansion to sustain itself. For centuries, the legions provided that expansion, pushing borders outward and restocking the supply of bodies. But empires cannot grow forever. When the conquests slowed, the supply of new slaves began to decline. And when the supply declined, the system began to reveal its hidden costs. The latifundia, optimized for extraction, were not designed for innovation or adaptation. Without fresh waves of captives, productivity stagnated. Estate owners squeezed more from the slaves they had, but there was a limit to how much human beings could produce under force. Meanwhile, the displaced citizens of Rome had spent generations depending on the state for bread. They had no land, no craft, no economic function, only their numbers and their potential for unrest. Social tensions rose as the gap between elite wealth and urban poverty became impossible to ignore. Emperors responded with more handouts, more games, more spectacle, anything to distract a population with no role in production. But distraction is not a solution. It is a delay. The economic fragility of the late empire was not caused by barbarian invasions or moral decay. It was caused by a system that had structured itself around one assumption: that conquest would never stop. When the assumption failed, the architecture revealed its weakness. Rome's wealth had never been built on the productivity of its own citizens. It was built on the extracted labor of people who had been captured, transported, and worked to death. And a society that organizes itself around extraction eventually finds that it has extracted everything, including its own resilience. Now step forward 2,000 years to a world that rarely uses chains but still depends on ultra-cheap labor. The modern economy has its own forms of zero-wage capital. The sweatshop worker who cannot quit, the migrant trapped by debt, the informal laborer with no rights. These workers are not owned in the legal sense, but they are replaceable in a way that gives employers similar power. When labor is abundant and desperate, wages can be pushed towards survival rather than dignity. And when wages are low enough, entire industries reorganize around that cheapness. Factories locate where labor is cheapest, not where it is most skilled. Supply chains optimize for cost by sourcing from places where workers have no leverage. The result is rapid growth for those at the top and stagnant wages for those in the middle. The middle class, like Rome's small farmers, finds itself squeezed between ultra-cheap production abroad and automation at home. Debt replaces wages as the mechanism that maintains consumption. People borrow to live, and the borrowing becomes a new form of dependence. The logic is the same. When labor is treated as a replaceable cost rather than a share of value, wealth concentrates upward, and the society that allows this eventually discovers that its own citizens have been rendered economically irrelevant. They still exist, but they no longer produce. They consume, they vote, they grow restless. But the system that displaced them no longer needs them for the work that generates real wealth. Rome kept its displaced population quiet with bread and circuses. Modern societies keep theirs quiet with credit and entertainment. Both are temporary solutions to a structural problem. A population with no economic function cannot be supported forever by extraction alone. The parallel is not exact, but the pattern repeats. Systems that rely on ultra-cheap labor can grow rapidly while quietly eroding the social contract. And when the growth slows, the erosion becomes visible. Rome's story is not a warning about slavery. In the moral sense, it is a warning about control as an economic model. Because control works. For a while, it produces efficiency, scale, and wealth. But it also produces fragility, because control depends on conditions that cannot last forever. Conquests and populations resist. Replaceable workers eventually become scarce or rebellious. And when the control breaks, there is no foundation underneath. No innovation, no broad prosperity, no middle class to absorb the shock. Just a hollow structure that once looked powerful and now looks empty. The wealth of Rome was real. The growth was real. The empire was real, but it was built on a mechanism that hid its own costs until the costs became impossible to ignore. And the same is true of any system that treats human beings as disposable inputs rather than participants. The chains are different now, but the architecture has a familiar shape. It transfers value upward, concentrates power, and calls the result growth, until the growth stops and the transfer becomes visible. Rome didn't just conquer people, it turned conquest itself into an economic model. And when the conquests stopped, the model began to collapse. If you want to understand the systems that shape your world, you have to look beneath the surface. You have to ask not just who benefits, but how the mechanism works. And you have to be willing to see that growth and fragility often come from the same source. We build this channel to explore those hidden mechanisms, the structures of money, power, and history that most people never question. If that kind of thinking matters to you, consider subscribing, because the systems aren't going to explain themselves.